for coming to our session this morning on Asian Catholic diaspora. We're fortunate to have two speakers with us today. Our first speaker is Jaisy Joseph, who is a doctoral student in systematic theology at Boston College and author of the book, The Struggle for Identity Among SyroMalabar Catholics. Joseph's research focuses on the development of pre-colonial Christianities outside of Roman influence. She also critically examines the impact of Eastern Christianities on notions of Catholicity in the United States. In addition to her academic pursuits, Joseph is a member of the SyroMalabar Catholic Diocese of Chicago and a member of Jesus Youth, an international Catholic lay movement at the service of the Church. We're fortunate to hear a paper entitled Negotiations Within the Existential In-Between, SyroMalabar Catholics in Diaspora. Please join me in welcoming Jaisy Joseph.
So I just want to start off by thanking everyone for coming and for this great conversation. I was telling Dr. Buddy that I've been taking so many notes and it's really been enriching my own understanding. So hopefully this will also contribute to the conversation moving forward. So, negotiations. Negotiations of the Existential In-Between, SyroMalabar Catholics in Diaspora. So in A Theology of Liberation, Gustavo Gutierrez reflects on how liberation theology emerged from a profound consciousness of kairos. Kairos is understood biblically as a propitious and demanding time in which the Lord challenges us and we are called upon to bear a very specific witness. In the 50 years since the Second Vatican Council, liberation theology has borne a specific witness to the irruption of the poor. Meditating on the kairos of the third millennium, Gioacchino Campese argues that we are in the midst of a related but distinct phenomenon, the irruption of migrants. This irruption also demands a specific witness to make present those who are often absent from the societal and ecclesial consciousness. Asian American theologies, Campese argues, provide an important theological current that contributes to this emerging consciousness of migration. Because more than 60% of Asian Americans are first-generation immigrants, the reality of living in between the culture of their ancestors and the culture of their residents profoundly influences how they understand reality as existing in between. In light of this existential experience of living in between two or more cultures, I will first examine the pan-ethnic Asian American articulation of a hyphenated identity and its attending epistemology. I will then focus on two negotiations made within the current diaspora of SyroMalabar Catholics from Kerala, India. I will conclude by examining the potential ecclesiological contributions of migration for the Church of the third millennium. So part one. The Existential In-Between, Asian American Identity and Epistemology. According to Vietnamese-American theologian Peter C. Phan, the very existential condition of the immigrant entails a distinct epistemology and hermeneutics, a particular way of perceiving and interpreting reality, that is of oneself, of others, the cosmos, and ultimately God. Existing in between the culture of their ancestors and the culture of their residents, they belong fully to neither culture, but participate within both. This existential predicament suggests that the individual is neither fully here nor fully there, neither fully Asian nor fully American. Phan describes the multiple dimensions of this condition when he states that spatially, it is to dwell at the periphery or at the boundaries. Politically, it means not residing at the centers of power of the two intersecting worlds, but occupying the precarious and narrow margins where two dominant groups meet and clash. Socially, to be in between is to be part of a minority, a member of a marginalized group. Culturally, it means not fully belonging or being integrated into or accepted by either cultural system, being a mestizo, a person of mixed race. Linguistically, the betwixt and between person is bilingual, but may not achieve a mastery of both languages, and often speaks them with a distinct accent. And psychologically and spiritually, the person does not possess a well-defined and secure self-identity, and is often marked with an excessive rootlessness and an inordinate desire to belong. While all this may appear negative, the Asian American epistemological framework is naturally multi-perspectival, which has its positive elements. Korean American theologian Song-Kyun Lee argues for the creative potential of existing in between different perspectives by using anthropologist Victor Turner's concept of liminality. According to Turner, liminality is a transitional time that involves 3 stages. The first stage is separation, or departure from social structure, especially social status and social role. The middle stage of liminality is a time in which a person is neither one thing nor another, but betwixt and between. And the final stage of reincorporation into structure, with a new identity or with a new perspective on the existing structure. Furthermore, Sang discovers 3 creative potentials of this liminal space, which can contribute to a new perspective on reality. First, the liminal space leads to an openness to the new. According to Turner, because one is in between, neither here nor there, one is freed of the normal obligations that belong to a particular status or social identity. Turner describes liminality as society's subjunctive mood, where suppositions, desires, and possibilities also become legitimate. While chaotic and frightening, because the validation and guidance of the old system has been left behind, and the future lays indeterminate, it promises new beginnings. The second creative potential is the emergence of comunitas. According to Turner, liminality also contributes to genuine human community. Because individuals must set aside old social statuses and roles when they leave the homeland, they are open to more spontaneous expressions of community with others. Such comunitas, however, cannot stand alone, but eventually gives way to structure to meet organizational and material needs of people. Yet, any structure that is not infused with the values of comunitas becomes inhospitable. Finally, the liminal space provides a creative space for prophetic knowledge and action. The existential in-between naturally places the individual at a distance from the centers of power. This distance enables the freedom to be critical of these centers and to defamiliarize the familiar. Novelty, according to Turner, emerges from the unprecedented combinations of familiar elements. So in addition to being critical, this space possesses a transformative capacity. So in light of this epistemological situation that emerges from the existential in-between of the Asian American experience, Part 2 will specifically examine 2 recent negotiations made in the SyroMalabar Catholic diaspora of immigrants from Kerala, India. So Part 2, borderline negotiations in the SyroMalabar Catholic diaspora. When discussing the experience of migration, Fan claims that, quote, each culture contains within itself several significant varieties and is itself an ever-changing and dynamic reality. This description is no less true of SyroMalabar Catholics. Noted church historian Placid Boripara describes their hyphenated existence even prior to migration, when he defines this Eastern Catholic community as Hindu in culture, Christian in religion, and Oriental in worship. Migration, especially in the past 50 years, interrupts this narrative of origins and creates a liminal space in which old patterns and social statuses are contested within a new context. This situation leads to what post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha refers to as borderline negotiations. Resisting binary representations, these negotiations produce hybrid, hyphenated identities amidst experiences of conflict, questioning, and critical honesty. The following, therefore, like I said earlier, will consider two recent borderline negotiations within the SyroMalabar Catholic community in the United States. The first negotiation is related to how North American views of Catholicity challenge caste endogamy practiced by a subset of SyroMalabar Catholics known as Cananea Catholics. The second negotiation is a product of Portuguese colonization and is related to the use of the Syrian cross and the European crucifix in a Dallas SyroMalabar Catholic parish. While these borderline negotiations present deep tensions within the community, they will be examined in light of Turner's theory of liminality in order to discover any creative potential and contribution to Catholic ecclesiology. So case 1, endogamy and Catholicity. During the 3rd century, persecutions led a mass migration of Syrian Christians from Syria throughout all of Asia. Many of them settled in the Malabar, or southwest India, and because of previous trade connections with the Thomas Christians. And this place is now currently Kerala. Legend has it that upon leaving, these Cananea Christians swore to their patriarch that they would maintain their racial purity and remain true to the faith. So while these Christians introduced the liturgy that these two communities now share and established stronger ties with the East Syrian patriarchs, the Cananeas have supposedly remained endogamous throughout the centuries. In other words, to marry outside of the community is to lose church membership. This separation was ecclesiastically recognized by a papal bull in 1911 when Pope Pius X established the Vicariate of Corteum exclusively for Cananeas. After migration to the United States, Cananea Catholics continue to establish separate faith communities. In this liminal space of migration, however, many question the Catholicity of endogamous practices. Leaving behind the social structures influenced by Hindu caste practices, many migrants from mixed marriages question the custom of denying church membership to those who marry non-Cananeas. These questions surfaced internally as communities in the US organically developed in the 1980s. In 2001, however, immediately after the official inauguration of the SyroMalabar Catholic Diocese here in Chicago, Roman Catholic Bishop Patrick J. McGrath of San Jose wrote a letter to Bishop Jacob Engardia, the first SyroMalabar Catholic bishop in North America. In this letter, Bishop McGrath reported a bi-ritual priest who served both the SyroMalabar Cananea mission and a Roman Catholic community. While welcoming the Eastern Catholic presence in San Jose, McGrath emphasized that the practice of endogamy allowed by this priest was unacceptable because it, quote, breeds a sense of classism and racism and is totally out of keeping with the ecclesial and civil life in the United States, end quote. In addition to being contradictory to North American Catholic practices, McGrath quotes the 1986 instruction from the Congregation for Oriental Churches, which states that the special ministry for the Cananea community can be faithfully conducted only on the basis that those Cananea Catholics who marry non-Cananea spouses enjoy equal status in the ministry. This congregation does not accept the customary practices followed in Kerala of excluding from the community those who marry non-Cananea spouses is extensible to the United States of America. So Bishop Jacob responded in 2003 that he upholds the statement of the Congregation for the Oriental Churches. He states that Cananea missions are for all Cananea Catholics, but no Cananea mission in this diocese is strictly endogamous. Cananea Catholics who get married to non-Cananea spouses will continue in their Cananea missions along with their spouses and their children. This stance was officially promulgated in 2012 when Bishop Jacob sent a letter to all of the Cananea priests and faithful in the US. Because family unity and spiritual well-being is a primary concern, Cananeas who marry non-Cananeas cannot be discriminated or excluded from the community. Engardia ended his letter with the proposal that though mixed families may wish to attend the other SyroMalabar parishes, they must have the freedom to also participate in their own native Cananea communities. 3 months later, hundreds of Cananea Catholics from all over the United States flew to Chicago to protest the bishop's letter in front of his house. Extolling endogamy as a 1,700-year-old tradition, the protest coordinator further expressed how the Cananea felt hurt by the Catholic Church's rejection of their right to continue this practice. In a separate interview with NPR, another individual claimed that, quote, endogamy is the essence of the Cananea community, and that the larger Catholic Church should not ask the Cananea to sacrifice a defining characteristic of their identity. In contrast, a few Cananeas in the US have married outside of the community and are filing a canonical lawsuit for discriminatory practices against their family. Such practices include the refusal of the sacraments of baptism and marriage to mixed Cananea families, the rejection of donations from these families, and a lack of admission to parish council meetings. In the midst of this liminal border space between old practices of endogamy and an American ethos of inclusivity, the SyroMalabar Church is given the task of negotiating its understanding of Catholicity. First, when Bodibar had claimed that the Thomas Christians were Hindu in culture, he wanted to emphasize that this Christian tradition belonged to the Malabar soil. It was not a product of Western colonization or missions. In the context of migration, however, the question arises about the extent to which Hindu caste practices and social structures influence the identity formation of Cananea Catholics within the SyroMalabar Catholic Church. Second, this community must question the viability of claiming endogamy rather than the gospel kerygma as an essential characteristic of their ancient ecclesial identity. In the midst of this internal marginalization, it appears as though any creative potential for newness, communitas, and prophetic action is frustrated by a deep misunderstanding of Catholicity and communion. Because of this misunderstanding, both sides resort to equal rights language that accuse the other of discrimination. So case 2, a tale of two crosses. So this is our cathedral here in Chicago, and as you can see, we have both the crucifix and the St. Thomas cross. So in November 2013, an individual in Dallas recorded a YouTube video of himself burning the Marto Maslevat, or the St. Thomas cross. This liturgical symbol is often displayed throughout the sanctuary during the liturgy. He claims that the cross is unscriptural, and that only the crucifix, which contains the body of Jesus, should be used in the community. His actions are baffling unless placed within the narrative of the SyroMalabar Church's colonial history. The conciliar document, Orientalum Ecclesiarum, the Decree on Eastern Catholic Churches, alludes to the complicated colonial relationship between Roman Catholic and Eastern Catholic churches when it states that all members of the Eastern Rite should know and be convinced that they can and should always preserve their legitimate liturgical rite and their established way of life, and that these may not be altered except to obtain for themselves an organic improvement. All these, then, must be observed by the members of the Eastern rites themselves. Besides, they should attain to an ever greater knowledge and a more exact use of them, and if their regard they have fallen short owing to the contingencies of times and persons, they should take steps to return to their ancestral traditions. So in the particular case of SyroMalabar Catholics, this reference to preserving legitimate liturgical rite and established way of life, and the need to return to ancestral traditions, refers to the disastrous consequences of the 16th century colonial Latinizations imposed upon these Thomas Christians. The Synod of Diaspora in 1599 was the main means of colonizing the Thomas Christians and imposing greater Latin conformity. One of the Latinizations included the European devotion to the suffering Christ in the form of the crucifix. The Synod also brought the Thomas Christians directly under Portuguese control by severing ties with the East Syrian patriarchs and burning many of their ancient books and records. According to George Nettingat, the changes in the life and mores of the Thomas Christian community, enacted by the presumed knowledge and power of the Portuguese missionaries, were charged with a latent explosive potential, destined to detonate after half a century, leaving behind cataclysmal ecclesial debris, the reverberations of which are still experienced today. He's referring not only to the multiple divisions within the Thomas Christian community following the Synod, but also the liturgical debates that still overwhelm the hierarchy in Kerala and the United States. In light of this colonial devastation, many bishops who attended the Second Vatican Council interpreted the aforementioned section from Orientalum Ecclesiarum as a mandate to restore the Oriental nature of one of the most highly Latinized Eastern Catholic churches. One attempt was to encourage veneration of the St. Thomas Cross. Nevertheless, there has been a strong resistance to these efforts. Disputes over liturgical reform erupted along the lines of Syrian restoration and Indian enculturation. Eventually, the two sides became institutionalized as the Archdiocese of Changanasheri, which supported Syrianization, and the Archdiocese of Ernakulam, which supported enculturation. The problem, of course, is that while this is a temporary solution that worked for the generation immediately after the Second Vatican Council in Kerala, it proved faulty when individuals migrated to the United States. They found themselves with other SyroMalabar Catholics who had been liturgically formed from the other side of the spectrum. The situation became critical in 2010 when both factions in Dallas created internet blogs that anonymously attacked the other. The tensions began with a small controversy over whether the St. Thomas Cross or the crucifix should hang at the center of the new worship space. The insults, however, became increasingly vociferous and threatened to tear apart the community. One parishioner is quoted as saying, "We don't like the Marthama cross because it is a creation of man. The crucifix is biblically based." In 2010, members of St. Alphonsus SyroMalabar Catholic Church staged a protest outside of their parish when Bishop Jacob insisted on placing the St. Thomas cross above the altar. Although tensions have cooled and now a crucifix hangs above the altar, this borderline negotiation reveals much more than an isolated controversy over religious symbols. In terms of the creative potential of this liminal space, it reveals how much more the laity, in addition to the clergy, need a deeper catechesis of the symbolic significance of the liturgy. In a post-Vatican II era, active participation of the entire community is expected. Without proper mystagogical formation, misinterpretations will continue to abound. A proper understanding would be that the fullest articulation of the faith necessitates both Christ's resurrection, as represented by the empty cross, and his crucifixion. Because this liminal space frees the community to question the hierarchy in a way that was unknown in previous generations, the clergy must be ready to engage the questions with answers that guide the entire community to greater understanding. Finally, the community in the U.S. can serve as a prophetic voice to the Indian hierarchy in two ways. First, these immigrant communities further reveal the necessity of finding a resolution to these liturgical debates. Second, this diaspora community reveals how the hierarchy must take the faithful, who now belong to a global phenomenon, much more seriously. With migrants not only in the United States, but also in Europe, the Middle East, Southeast and Far East Asia, and Australia, the SyroMalabar hierarchy can no longer confine themselves to the local Kerala context. So finally, part 3, the ecclesiological implications of the existential in-between. Reflecting on this irruption of migrants, the Catholic Church as a whole cannot ignore what this global phenomenon means to be church. In an attempt to contribute to the greater visibility of migrants, we have explored the contemporary experience of SyroMalabar Catholic faithful. Resisting romantic idealizations, I have strived to present an honest portrayal of both the strengths and weaknesses of this community. Indeed, endogamy and liturgical confusions reveal the necessity of a more robust understanding of what it means to be Catholic. Given this necessity, the following will explore the potential contributions of the existential in-between to Catholic ecclesiology. The experience of migration and the existential in-between naturally lends itself to reflection on Catholicity, as we have mentioned throughout this conference. Catholicity does not imply a global uniformity, according to a particular standard, such as the Latin conformity of colonialism. Catholicity is a mark of the Church that recognizes God at work in various cultures and experiences. Campese reminds us that immigrants, with their rich diversity and urgent need of inclusion, continue to remind the whole Church of the fundamental importance of Catholicity, that is at the same time a gift, a mission, and a hope. Moreover, while many Asian Americans view the ecclesial space as a refuge within a foreign culture, it becomes harmful when they regard this space as a bastion of cultural preservation. Catholicity calls the church to welcome the stranger, to experience the same healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation that Christ offers. Rather than escape from the larger community, migrants and their children are called to develop an empathic sensitivity to the liminal and marginal experiences of others. Another way of engaging Catholicity is to retrieve the conciliar image of the church as a pilgrim people of God, in light of these migratory experiences. Indonesian-American theologian A. Bagus Laksana notes the particular fecundity of the pilgrimage metaphor for the ecclesiological and existential in-between. The migrant experience becomes a significant lens through which we come to understand what it means to be a Christian pilgrim. It reveals a journey not only inward, but also vertically in ascent to God and horizontally in relation to neighbor. A crucial element of this journey, he argues, is that despite the distance between the present moment and the eternal destination, the pilgrim is committed to never losing sight of the goal. The existential in-between, therefore, becomes a lifelong committed journey to the other, both God and neighbor. From the perspective of pilgrimage, the entire ecclesial experience is defined by a faith that has the courage to refuse the temptation to absolutize any one of the finite factors, and thereby to set up a false sense of security. To embrace this experience of liminality is to experience what Japanese theologian Fumitaka Matsuko calls holy insecurity. It is to place one's unresolved and ambiguous narrative into the hands of the divine writer, and to live with a sense of integrity in the in-between. The Church of the Third Millennium, therefore, must acknowledge the irruption of migrants as a time of kairos, in which the church is not just a church for migrants, but a migrant church, on pilgrimage together towards the heavenly Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your engaging talk. I felt to speak to the other, can also speak to you right next to me, but we do have some time for a few questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, there's a microphone to your left. And when you approach the mic, please have a clear and direct question rather than a comment or story. And we'll have time after our talk for further conversation. Mic's down in those.
Okay, I just had a quick question. In the photograph that you showed of the protest to maintain the marital endogamy practices, I could only see men. And so I'm wondering if the protest was male-dominated, or just if you could talk more about, do women see this issue of endogamy different, or something I know you and I have talked about, are the second generation, those born and raised here in the U.S., are they likely to continue this practice of endogamy, or more specifically, does the second generation, or do women have a voice in these debates?
Sure. So the reason I picked that picture was because the guy looked so into what his protest. But actually, there were families involved, and so there were actually youth and women also who were there. But I would say that in personal conversations with members of the second generation, it's very interesting. When we were in high school and college, they would question it and not be so concerned. But I would see now, I think the pressure to respect and honor family wishes is really influencing some of my friends, and I would say that they aren't pushing back. And so to really challenge it and to really challenge their parents, it is oftentimes to ostracize themselves from the community as well. So it's a very complicated issue that's related to more than just the church. But I think what I was trying to bring out is endogamous practices, if they're cultural, fine. But when you start making it an ecclesial practice, it becomes very problematic. To deny marriage and the sacrament of baptism only because you married outside of the community, not because you're in bad standing with the faith, that becomes really problematic. And I think that's something that we have to address internally. Sacraments should not be denied for any reason that's related to who you marry.
Thank you. Our Are there any additional questions?
I would like to add that
This is the microphone.
I already tell my rights on the screen. I was actually involved with all these things. The sad part of it is this. Even though you might be a Catholic from the SyroMalabar diocese itself, you still deny sacraments in the Catholic Church. So, I'm not going to make a long speech, but because after Second Vatican Council, they wanted everybody to be inclusive, etc. So we approached Cardinal Bernardino, the late Archbishop, to give a mission to the SyroMalabar Catholics. And he did give it on several conditions. I have all those papers in my file here, which clearly stated that it cannot be exclusive. And in fact, there were even rules saying that if you don't gain membership in the committees and all that, you cannot, etc. What has happened is they signed all those things. The Bishop of Kottayam and all that, they signed all those things. You don't have police power to do any of this. That's what has happened. Even the current Bishop of the SyroMalabar Diocese, he's actually clear because he has given everything in writing. But the Kanaya priests and led by the Bishop of Kottayam, who actually has no power here, but the people just follow him. So there is a lot of problems here happening. We brought it up to the attention to the NPR, if you get on, and she is given it one of her reviews. The NPR published also this. It's all available. It's a sad commentary on how you can be a Catholic and yet be denied membership because you want to keep the purity, the blood purity, which they refer to as a dogma. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, are there any additional questions? Okay, I actually have a question. I was struck and intrigued by your language of liminality and describing the migrant experience in between. I wonder if you've thought about how, I guess, Victor Turner's larger discussion of liminality might impact your research. So, for instance, after people go through a liminal space, they're normally reincorporated back into their original community, but part of the migrant experience is assuming that they're going to be in a new community. So how might that impact your work?
So I'm glad you brought that up, because this is actually part of a much larger paper that I obviously, for time reasons, had to shorten. But I wanted to talk about how there were two elements to how Turner describes reincorporation. And I think that reincorporation into the wider society is what we are in negotiation of. What does that actually mean? What does it mean for us to be reincorporated in terms of the American society and in terms of the home culture? That, I'm not sure, but I think that it's really his second aspect of a new perspective on what's going on. Because I think that oftentimes, especially in the second generation, when you're caught in this in-between, it just leads to confusion and I mean, despair, and so you often feel as though you have to pick one or the other. But I think that the promise of the positive aspects of liminality is that this in-between space is a space in and of itself too. And to be able to talk in that in-between space allows for that new perspective. And so maybe reincorporation into one or the other is not the option, but giving value to this space and that new perspective in and of itself contributing to a wider conversation. So I think that's where I'm headed towards, but I'm open to any suggestions or critiques on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wonder, the idea of someone remaining in a liminal space on the one hand seems really intriguing, but also, I guess, part of a larger discussion might be potentially problematic to just remain there and be part of it. It's supposed to allow a person to grow and to become a different version of themselves or a different part of society. And so I wonder if remaining in the liminal space might not be ideal.
Right.
It's interesting. All right, well, thank you. I think we're right on schedule, so perhaps we'll give a All right, thanks. So we'll move on to our next presentation. Our next presenter is Father Linh Hoang, who is an associate professor of religious studies at Siena College and the author of the book Rebuilding Religious Experience, Vietnamese Refugees in America. Father Hoang's research focuses on Asian American studies, Vietnamese Catholicism, globalization, and historical theology. Along with his academic pursuits, Father Hoang is a Franciscan priest with the Holy Name Province in New York City. We're fortunate to hear his paper today entitled Vietnamese Catholics and Globalization, Re-Imaging Mary as Asian. Please join me in welcoming Father Linh Hoang.
Good morning. First, I'd like to thank Bill, Francis, and Karen for inviting me back. It was nice to be back to DePaul after a few years. And after listening to all the discussion in Diaspora, I know that few of us talked about having to change our talks because we had heard so many different things, and I was doing that last night and also this morning. So hopefully my paper will sound incoherent as we go along. So the study of diaspora is actually trending in Asian American studies. I'm using that sort of the internet lingo right there. Asian American studies is actually re-examining diaspora and reappropriating it. As David Palumbo Liu, an Asian American scholar, argues that the discourse of diaspora is often used as a litmus test for conservative and conserving predilections for establishing what it means to be authentically Chinese, Indian, and so on. This argument stresses that for Asian Americans, the turn to diaspora continues to uphold the idea of foreignness and strangeness of the Asian race in America, which has effectively excluded Asians from the traditional race debates pitting the majority whites against the minority blacks. A discussion of diaspora for Asian Americans then needs to explicitly include race. A few reasons are that, one, the increasing fragmentation and intensifying globalization, which maintains the value of collective identities, and with this, the difficulties in making clear determination about race versus ethnicity, especially for Asian Americans. This is compounding this turn to diaspora is the imperative of implicating Asian American experience beyond an American nationalist perspective that has tended to ignore the past, present, and future influence of Asia, not only on the global scale, but particularly for Asian Americans. So the turn to Asia is important since many Asian Americans are traveling back and forth to their countries of birth or their parents' country of birth. This is the transnational identity that is applied here, so the intersection between diaspora studies and transnational studies. It is a global connection crucial to understanding the Asian American community. Hence, my reflection on the Vietnamese diaspora is part of this broader Asian American consideration that holds in tension diaspora and race as necessary points of departure. This tension provides a tool to understand Vietnamese Catholics who, through fashioning a concrete image of the Virgin Mary, Mother of God, as Vietnamese, has asserted race as important in diaspora experience. And on my slides, actually, I just have pictures of Mary and her transitions from being Mary here, as we see Our Lady of Lavang, from 1798 to 1998. And so my PowerPoint isn't as sophisticated as JC, but we'll just sort of use the image here. So from Catholic mission history already, many of the images of Mary, Jesus, and some saints resemble white Europeans rather than possessing the distinctive cultural features of the Middle East, for that matter, any indigenous culture that was colonized. The production of statues in colonial Vietnam features dramatically white Europeans rather than any of the local characteristic. This remains in many areas of Vietnam today. And similarly, churches that were built in Vietnam have the Gothic facade that dots the landscape, maintains this foreignness of Christianity, all the while trying to be relevant in Vietnam. So nevertheless, the difference maintains a conscious divide that are religious, cultural, and racial. At the end of the war in Vietnam in 1975, many refugees fled to the United States and other parts of the world. The diaspora community began to rebuild their lives. Included in this plight was a group of over 170,000 Vietnamese refugees who were transported to the United States. And this transport of refugees plight, there were 5 different waves, and each of the waves considered the type, or we say people from different backgrounds that came. My family was in the first wave, and most of the people in the first wave who left from 1975 to 1978, those who had connections to American troops or to American workforces, really left easily. But also in the first wave were those who actually drifted on the boat, and my family is one of those families who actually drifted on a boat for 4 days before we were rescued by American ships. And so this transport of refugees then, after a resettlement strategy of dispersing the Vietnamese refugees throughout the 50 states, there was a conscious second migration effort by the Vietnamese themselves to be closer to family, to friends, and also to warmer climates. Through this second migration, Vietnamese communities forged enclaves and created new identities. And this enclave building is also, in another paper I talked about enclave building actually racialization, where lots of groups in the United States, minority groups gather, especially for blacks or Hispanic. Black, we could call it the ghetto, or for Hispanic, it's the barrio. But whereas Jews and Asian Americans is the enclave, but it's actually now putting Asian Americans away, not having to consider them as a part of the community, but still using the language of enclave as also a racialization of Asian Americans, the communities. So the Vietnamese Catholics, similar to many traditional Catholic communities, possess a strong devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary in order to fashion not just a Catholic identity, but a particular Catholic identity, grounded in their racial ethnic experience. So this presentation, I discussed the Blessed Mother's importance for the Vietnamese Catholic in diaspora as they transform a European-looking Mary to a Vietnamese-looking Mary through a contested history of her apparitions to persecuted Vietnamese. First, I will discuss the apparition of the Virgin Mary at Lavang in central Vietnam and setting it in a historical context for the Church. Second, I will examine the image chosen to represent Mary at Lavang and how the local religious practices influenced the popularity of her apparitions. Third, I will trace the production of the statue of Our Lady of Lavang in Orange County, California, for the 200th anniversary of her apparition in Vietnam. The statue, molded out of diasporic imagination, now situate race as an important aspect of religious practice. The conclusion would call for a further reflection in diaspora and race as important examinations for Asian and Asian American Catholic studies. The historian Jaroslav Pelikan wrote, and I quote, "The Virgin Mary has been more of an inspiration to more people than any other woman who ever lived," unquote. Stories of Mary offer hope and comfort to individuals. She is seen as a supernatural healer and guide. Of course, the oldest stories about Mary are found in the New Testament. Then early church Christians maintained to further emphasize the importance of the Virgin Mary. This is evidenced by the patristic writings of Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian, Athanasius, and Augustine. Belief about Mary has concretized at the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus in 431. The council's statement identified Mary as Theotokos, the one who gave birth to the one who is God. From these writings, as well from visual art found in the 3rd and 4th century Roman catacombs, there is ample evidence that Mary was highly esteemed and viewed as a maternal intercessor. So over the centuries, more regional stories of the Virgin Mary appeared, and it's from these regional stories collected from various corners of the world, the stories of her apparition to downtrodden people, young children, and those fleeing persecution began to influence a new and different turn in Marian devotion. These apparitional stories now have been passed down from local faith communities to the universal church. They continue to inspire and to actually compound millions of believers and non-believers alike. On December 1997, Pope John Paul II wrote to the Archbishop of Hue in Vietnam, exclaiming that on this happy occasion of the 2nd century of the apparition of the Blessed Virgin, I send you, Your Eminence, my affectionate apostolic blessing, which I willingly extend to the bishops, to the priests, and to those preparing for the priesthood, to the religious, and to all the faithful of Vietnam and the diaspora. The Pope's reference to the apparition is most interesting because there were 2 places in Vietnam that Marian apparitions. One in La Vang, which is more popularly known, and the other less known and actually disputed is Gioacchino. The account of Mary in La Vang was passed down orally, and there is no written document that exists from those who saw her. The last survivors in the 19th century are not even named by the priests who took their statement. So this oral transmission continues to be the only authority to Mary's apparition at La Vang. So in many cases it's still contested. First, the meaning of La Vang is significant to consider. There are actually 2 meanings depending on the diacritical mark. The first, La Vang, is the leaves of the tree in the forest, and La Vang is to cry out loud. So you can see there's an inflection on that. So when the story is passed down, some people said it was the lady in the forest, and others emphasized the crying of those seeking refuge. So the context. In 1798, the Tay Son Rebellion was a grassroots uprising against the ruling class in Vietnam, especially against the emperors, drew to its conclusion when a strong Nguyen emperor regained power. King Han Tin, crowned in 1792, perceived that the Catholic Church as a foreign enemy, began a cruel persecution of Catholics that lasted beyond his death until 1886, when the French seized full control. So the first apparition of Mary La Vang occurred in August 1798. Then refugees from the town of Quan Chi hid in the forest. She appeared as a beautiful lady wearing a dress and a long cape, holding a baby and accompanied by 2 angels. She heard their cry for help, and her message that she would always help them in time of need. So the Virgin Mother gave the people solace, instructed them to boil the La Vang for their medication, to heal those who were in pain. She also said that from that day on, all those who came to this place would have their prayers heard and answered. A tiny altar was then built at the site, which became a refuge for thousands fleeing persecution. There were also accounts that she appeared several more times during that period, but the apparition did not immediately draw believers to La Vang because the harsh terrain and the continued persecution made the journey quite treacherous. Nonetheless, small pilgrimages actually did begin to come in 1882. So after the persecution ended in 1886, an official church was actually built there. In 1901, the dedication of the new church of Our Lady of Vang drew more pilgrims to that place in small numbers. The Vatican has had an ambivalent history in terms of veneration of Mary and its official position on Marian apparitions. The attitude has created openings for apparitional claims and has complicated the church's ability to contain these claims. Official church policies offer clerical leaders a range of options in responding to apparitional claims. Diocesan priests may determine whether or not to initiate an investigation, depending on how significant the event appears to be. The Vatican may launch an investigation on its own initiative or at the request of laity or bishops. With respect to any particular claim, the Church may ultimately accept the apparition or representing supernatural activity, or they can issue a decision on the apparition, or state that there is no evidence of supernatural activity, or state that there is evidence that supernatural activity did not occur. So assessment of apparitional claims often have spanned many decades, and full acceptance have been extremely rare. So even though the apparition of Mary La Vang was never fully accepted or denied, John Paul II's statement, still recognize this and congratulate the Vietnamese Catholics on their faithful devotion to Mary. He went on further to support the rebuilding of the Basilica in commemoration of the anniversary, as I just stated earlier. So a few points of distinction between La Vang's apparition that are unlike the apparitions in Europe. First, the date. 1798 is actually before, previous to Lourdes or Fatima. And especially that also the messages at La Vang is different from the messages at Lourdes and Fatima, where there was more apocalyptic divination or actually discussion of punishment, where La Vang is more Mary's protection and liberation of those who are persecuted. And this idea of being a liberator and protector for the Vietnamese had helped the Vietnamese Catholics who have now given full dedication to Mary. Third, the image of Mary, the images of goddesses. Mary did not appear to colonizer, but to those who are persecuted, since there were no written documents, we can only speculate what the people saw. So one question, was the Mary they saw a Vietnamese woman? Did she look like them, or did she appear European to them because of the missionaries who were there? In places where Mary had appeared, such as the more famous Our Lady of Guadalupe and Medjugorje, the artistic rendition of these regional characteristics, especially of the people, as Sister Adine mentioned yesterday with Our Lady of Charity, where the people had Cuban characteristics and not Mary, but that there was this representation in that. But before I actually go into the image of the official Our Lady of La Vang, I would like to turn actually to the traditional culture of Vietnam that had reference for the goddesses and also the maternal prowess of women. Some skeptics of the La Vang apparition have stated that the women the people actually saw was Kuan Yin, which would make her a bodhisattva rather than Mary. This is intriguing because it provides the fact that the local people would have seen her as one of them, which would make her a local person rather than any foreign colonizer. From the La Vang event, The Martyr's History by Mr. Nguyen Van Tam, he stated that in 1820, at the beginning of the reign of Minh Mang, 3 local villages built a miu, which in Vietnamese is a kowtowing platform, a joss house, or an incense burning place. In reality, it was just a raised platform with a fence around it. The villagers who had used it to come to pay reference to that place learned decades before a Catholic described as a woman that had appeared in this site. Thus, the villagers yield the site to the Catholics. In his discussion of this, he actually sort of waxes over the tension between Buddhists and Catholics within Vietnam. So then, as the Buddhists gave the place over to Catholics, the vicar of the local parish modified the platform into a thatch roof building. This was actually the first church built in La Vang, and the conflation of Catholicism with Buddhism was not only caused by external factors of persecution and the need for camouflage, but also strongly affected by an internal theological element common to both religious traditions. So the speculation supports that the natural acceptance of Mary, not only by Vietnamese Catholics, but also by this larger population. Added to this also is that in Vietnam, by this time, there was a reappropriating of the goddess of Vietnam. And the goddess of Vietnam is also known as the Lady of the Realm. It also be applied to this rather easy acceptance of Mary. So traditionally, the cult of the mother goddess in Vietnam is a symbol of freedom from the oppressive Confucian structure. In Vietnam, by 1900, all of the Confucian schools were closed down. So by this time, Vietnam has also thrown off its Confucian oppression, and Our Lady, the goddess of Vietnam, was used as a symbol of casting off the oppression. And so her story continues to exist to survive through this oral transmission and to the collective consciousness of the people. Nevertheless, there was not a statue made of Mary or the goddess at this place at this particular time in 1820 to 1886. Only the altar exists, or a place for kowtowing. Furthermore, goddess worship endured and survived in what is claimed to be Vietnam's matriarchal and hence primitive period of history. Urban intellectuals in Vietnam believed prejudiciously that people living in rural and remote areas with a low level of education are more prone to misapprehend forces of nature or redress their failings in the face of a potent nature through the religious lens, that is, appropriating a mother goddess to protect them. So as Vietnamese ethnologists and scholars started to try to recapture what it is Vietnam is about, folklorists and ethnologists actually changed their tone after Vietnam opened its borders in 1990 to say that this actually was more of a trend, and so that it was a way to bring people back to Vietnam. So they actually said that the folklore of the goddess of Vietnam became more important. So this more nuanced designation makes it more palpable and also commercially appealing to a global world that has now descended on Vietnam as a destination tourist spot. So the goddess worship has also uncovered the culturally hybrid lady of the realm. It is the idea that she becomes multi-ethnic, heterodox, constantly mutating cultural landscapes of Vietnam herself, casting off oppressors, become the original cultural accomplishment, which has enriched the storehouse of Vietnamese natural culture. So this enrichment of the Vietnamese natural culture has grasped by the government to reimagine itself on this global scale in order to improve the country financially and politically. So this backdrop is important to remember as we move back to how Mary is then represented as Our Lady of La Vang. So in 1900, on the occasion of the first pilgrimage to the Lady of La Vang Convention, Bishop Louis Casper, a French bishop, placed a French model statue of Our Lady of Victory from Paris, and this is Our Lady of Victory. This is the statue that is in Our Lady of Victory Church in Paris. And this was what the Digma La Vang, as the Vietnamese used to recapture her image. This image, you see Mary holding baby Jesus to her side, and this event added and made this the official image of Our Lady of La Vang. In 1954, the statue of Our Lady of La Vang was then brought from Chu Bang back to the Holy Shrine, and the Vietnamese Bishops' Conference chose the Church of Our Lady of La Vang as the national shrine in honor of the Immaculate Conception. La Vang then became a national Marian center for Vietnam in April 1961. Pope John XXIII elevated the Church of La Vang to the rank of a minor basilica in August of that year. The statue was actually destroyed during the bombings of Vietnam in 1972. In 1975, another statue was constructed to represent Our Lady of La Vang. Like the first one, it was modeled after the image of Our Lady of Victory. The statue represented Our Lady of La Vang until 1998, when it was replaced on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of her apparition. Now the reappropriating of Mary, making her Vietnamese. The first attempt to indigenize or to Vietnamize Our Lady of La Vang was through the efforts of Vietnamese Catholics living in Orange County. This is the real Vietnamese of Orange County, and we have a real priest of Orange County sitting among us. So in 1983, Vietnamese Catholic of Orange County, California created the Vietnamese Catholic Cultural Center. Masses were not held at the center, and they required also to make an annual monetary contribution to the diocese. But it became a place for Vietnamese Catholics to share faith and socialize. And I just wanted to put an aside where Vietnamese Catholics in San Jose, California had a more difficult time also creating their center. They also had protests, and as Jaisy was mentioning about the protests in Chicago, Vietnamese protested the diocese in 1981 to create their center in San Jose. There wasn't a concerted protest effort in Orange County, but there was a tension that Vietnamese Catholics wanted to build their own center in 1983. So within this context of structural marginalization of the Vietnamese Catholics in the US, they turned toward Our Lady of La Vang as unique cultural representation of their identity within the Catholic Church. Our Lady of La Vang, though, was not commonly known outside of Vietnam, and some speculate that the lack of recognition from the Vatican had limited her popularity to a larger Vietnamese Catholic population in the diaspora. Perhaps precisely because of their particular association with Vietnam and Vietnamese identity within the Catholic Church, that Our Lady of La Vang became a symbolic, ethnic, racial marker for the Vietnamese Catholic to distinguish themselves from other Catholics in the United States. So in 1985, Vietnamese Catholics in the US began a concentrated effort to elevate the symbols of Our Lady of La Vang as an ethnic marker on a global scale. And this year, Catholics in Vietnam petitioned the Vatican to canonize the 117 martyrs. Vietnamese American Catholics joined this request, marking a recognition of their compatriots over the decade. The Vatican approved the canonization. Then in 1988, Pope John Paul II elevated Andrew Dullac and companions as the saints. Their feast day is now November the 24th in the church calendar. During this canonization process also, the Vietnamese Catholics campaigned to recognize the Vatican of the apparition of Our Lady of La Vanne. But the Vatican did not make a statement or comment on this, but instead they created a center for the pastoral care for the overseas Vietnamese Catholics in the diaspora. Then in 1994, Vietnamese American Catholics in Orange County, California, constructed their version of Mary named Our Lady of Vietnam. Nan Van, a Vietnamese artist and sculptor, created the statue. I'll go back to those, but the statue that he created was the one on the right. And this was called Our Lady of Vietnam for the center in Orange County, California. In visiting Vietnamese priests from the Diocese of Hue in Vietnam, invited Van Nhan to create a new statue of Our Lady of La Vanne, modeled after the statue that they saw in Orange County, California. And thus she becomes the Our Lady of La Vanne for those living in Vietnam. And then the statue of Our Lady of La Vanne is officially recognized when John Paul II blessed the new recreated statue with their under the anniversary. So the devotion to Our Lady of La Vanne now is now reimagined as a Vietnamese Mary, views the way in the diasporic community has used her to reflect upon and to re-identify with their ethnic identity within a multicultural society. Also, image now breaks through boundaries of who can identify as Catholics. There are now 15 parishes across the United States that is named for Our Lady of La Vanne, with a 16th parish to open in 2018 in San Jose, California, which will cost about $40 million to create. So the aesthetics function from works of art and image can be used in healing and empowerment. In this case of Our Lady of La Vanne, has begun to heal the pain of those in the diaspora who had fled persecution and empower Vietnamese Catholics in Vietnam to assert their place in the universal church. They are no longer foreigners in their own land because they embrace and practice foreign religion, but now their religion is theirs, captured in the image of Mary. It is casting off colonial power, embracing a new image of Catholic identity. The Vietnamese Catholics see Mary as representing them, and not just an external protector, but one who truly walks with the oppressed and the persecuted. So suffering of the oppressed is never legitimate. It is never legitimate, it is always resisted. So the power of this common symbol and narrative, as well as the negative use of collective identities such as diaspora, can be transformed in this tragic history of the Vietnamese Catholics. So in conclusion, Mary's importance as a figure and a symbol has varied through Roman Catholic history, and she has been depicted as a queen in heaven and as a peasant girl. But her spiritual status continued to rise in fluctuating papal encouragement and discouragement of Marian devotion. Her place in Vietnamese Catholic history is quite important as we trace her to the tumultuous history of Vietnam to the diaspora community. This reinforced identity of the apparition of Mary La Vanne has created a stronger connection for Vietnamese Catholics around the world to her homeland, especially when Pope John Paul II recognized the apparition of Our Lady of La Vanne as the patroness of Vietnam. So the speed in which the country of Vietnam embraced modernity and globalization during the 1990s grossly exaggerated the paradoxes inherent to those transformative processes. A real energy to develop, to move forward, and to modernize was partnered by an intense desire to look back, to reclaim, and actually to retrieve what was lost. We can say that the lost identity of the goddess of Vietnam has then resurrected to the apparition of Mary for Vietnamese Catholics. Both are now recognized and revered in Vietnam and in the diaspora. This leads to a further investigation and studies that can only say that the recent interest in goddess study in Vietnam takes into consideration all the matriarchs of Vietnamese history. Finally, the image in Christianity bears all the intensity and of the need and desire to access to the inaccessible divine. Conceptions of Mary becomes touchstones of identity, cultural reference points, and beacons of moral constancy speaks to and are shaped by the very similar dilemma people face in these different national and diasporic contexts. For the same reason that certain readings of these images of Mary are shared across Vietnam's border, one finds a considerable variety of uses about them within the country. Views of Mary as patroness, as business partner, as underwriter of smuggling and escape from the country, or alternately as shameful marks of backwardness and ignorance, sit side by side with those expressed by folklorists and ethnologists that tie her to the expression of sustenance and the national collectivity and also within the diaspora. Such diversity of opinions reflect the complexity of the society in which Our Lady of Lam Vang is now located, just as suggests the inability of the state to constrain a unified reading of these religious and cultural practices. Mary's role as a marker of ranges from status, race, ethnic, gender, occupation, and class distinction also reminds us that there are more subtle borders than those of state, non-state membership, or of a national territory, which Mary gives expression. Such plurality of interpretation point to the multiplicity of social concerns that animate religious practices and underlies the need to carefully attend to the time and the place in which interpretation of Mary is situated. Thank you. Now, I just want to go through some of the pictures of the actual apparition. So this is the actual place where Mary appeared, and it's under the tree of. This is in the Lam Vang area. Again, Lam Vang is not really a village. It just got built up because of the apparition, because it really is a forest area. And the nation, this was under actually the communist regime, that even took and made stamps of Our Lady of Lam Vang. You see, this is from the original statue that they used to sort of propagandize Our Lady of Lam Vang to attract people back to Vietnam and pay the attention. And as I mentioned, this was the rendition that was made by the sculptor Lam Vang, and this has now become the national symbol of Our Lady of Lam Vang for those in Vietnam and for the diaspora. And then finally, this is Our Lady of Lam Vang at the National Basilica in Washington, D.C. So I think there it's called Our Lady of Vietnam and Our Lady of Lam Vang, but originally it's now situated, and in the basilica it's built near the crypt, and it's one of the only lady that actually has its own sort of little grotto under the crypt at the National Shrine. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for your presentation. We have some time left for questions, so as in the previous talk, if you have a question, please approach the microphone, just should be in the center, and approach with a clear and direct question, please. Thank you. And don't be shy.
Thank you, Father Huang, for your presentation. My question is that you mentioned that the move to indigenize the Lam Vang statue came from, the impulse came from America. Were there any local considerations as to why they felt that such a move to indigenize the version of Lam Vang was necessary?
I think one of the efforts when the Catholics in Orange County wanted to build a national parish, they were denied, and their support for that is that because the Koreans asked for one and they received theirs, but as the Vietnamese were trying to ask for one, they were denied the parish. So they created the center, raising the funds to build it, and they really wanted to make a mark in that area. Also, what was happening in Orange County at that time, Orange County is, we would say, predominantly white and very conservative. But the Vietnamese started to come to Orange County and actually buy up land and actually built a little Vietnam. It's now the largest little Saigon outside of Saigon. And so to create, sort of, to put their foot down as their foundation, the center also, we would say, takes on a lot of Asian architectural structure with a swooping roof and sort of asking a geomancer to come in for the directions of the the doors and the windows and so forth. I think the impetus to put the mark of Vietnamese identity in the enclave is also something that really asked for this image, because most Vietnamese, and I remember growing up seeing Mary as, you know, European looking and so forth. And actually, again, I should also say that not all Vietnamese have embraced this. This is slowly catching on as they continue to emphasize on the Lavang image. So I think it was a reclaiming of a lost identity in some respect, because being stateless people, who as refugees, they're stateless and really no identity, because the state isn't recognizing your identity of where you. So I think that was some of the background to why the people in Orange County wanted to assert really Vietnamese-looking Mary. And
as a follow-up to that, would you be able to tell us a little bit about how the Vietnamese Catholics in Vietnam responded to the indigenization?
My understanding of it was they were very much all in support of that, because the Vietnamese Catholics who in Vietnam, they were only able to open up their churches and reclaim the convents in the 1990s. And so the Catholics sort of fell underground, and as they celebrated and so forth, they had to keep their worship and practices quiet. And so this idea of being able to reclaim, you know, not only Mary, but the Catholic faith, but now in a way that they can recognize, became very popular. And actually in Vietnam, I think the use of her image as Vietnamese is more popular than those in the diaspora, like in Europe or in other parts of Australia. I'm not sure about Australia, but I think they've also accepted some in some places.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Actually, the ethnic communities all have centers in Orange County. It's just that the Koreans were allowed to say Mass on Sundays and the Vietnamese weren't, and you probably know the reasons why that was the case. Your presentation does bring up some other issues in terms of gender and race and overall society. Right next to the Vietnamese Center in Orange County is Our Lady of Lavang Parish, which was Our Lady of Lourdes, which was suppressed and then built back up as Our Lady of Lavang, and is now a Hispanic Vietnamese community. It has its issues, but what it signifies, though, is with the Vietnamese presence, there's a new image we can give to the wider public. And your presentation focuses on the acceptance of Our Lady of Lavang within the Vietnamese community. But how do we get beyond, like some of our conversations we had before, is beyond just saying this is our ethnic, but this is rather a gift to the whole church. Our Lady of Lavang should be our Marian image, not just for the Vietnamese community, but for the wider church in the United States as well, just as Guadalupe is, just as Lourdes of Panama. So I'll let you answer. Try to answer that first.
Well, I think she has become, I mean, she is universal. And I think the acceptance of that first is for the Vietnamese in the diaspora from all over. Because the dispersion of 3 million Vietnamese, that are in Europe and South America and so forth. But yes, but you have to begin with the local people first in order then to offer it to be universal. And I think it has been offered in the sense that the inclusion of these centers, and that the idea that the Mary speaks to those now who are oppressed, not just to give an apocalyptic, prophecy and so forth, but now Mary becomes a liberator, and a liberator in the sense that she continues to uphold anyone who feels persecuted. So in that sense, I think that's where Mary's place becomes important for those in diaspora. Your second.
The other one is, we talked about the Asianization of Jesus, and how we see Jesus as an Asian and as an infant, but when he grows up, we have a much more difficult time. And so it seems like we can put an Asian face to Mary, but not to God the Father or Jesus.
Actually, that has been done, and I think that was done for the Korean community,
sure.
Because it was something requested by a Korean priest, and Robert Lentz, who's the iconographer, offered it to the Korean community, and there was a mixed reception.
Sure. So
there was more mixed.
Talk about why we gravitate more to Mary, but we have a hard time in terms of the male figures.
Well, I think, because I mean, this happened in the Korean community, but I would say that we shouldn't. I mean, that's from my own perspective. But what Robert told me when he offered this to the Korean community was that actually it was more from the leaders, so the priests, nuns, and so forth, had a harder time accepting the image of Jesus as Asian than those who were the laity. So that his first, he sent it to Koreans living in America. It was not a full acceptance, but they had an easier time with it. But then when he was sent to Korea, there was an outright, no, this doesn't make sense. So, but you can actually Google seeing the Korean Jesus, and there's Jesus crucified with the thorns on his head that is represented. I'm not sure how to actually answer why it's so difficult for certain communities. In the Vietnamese, with I think the early accepting of Mary as Vietnamese, there are been renditions of Jesus as Asian or as Vietnamese, and I haven't heard such an uproar from the community itself. And so I'm not sure if it's from particular ethnic communities that are slowly accepting this or slowly trying to consider what does this image mean for them.
Are there additional questions? I guess I'm just wondering if in your research and if in your not just preparation for this presentation, but in general, have you considered some of the psychological, I guess, implications of why having an image that resembles a person is important for one's devotion? So is it, I mean, obviously you're saying, and the statue shows a very European-looking Mary, and I'm assuming people were practicing the faith and still were devoted, but is there any sort of increase or further appreciation that comes from having a statue that resembles a person?
Well, first, I haven't looked into the psychological side of it. So I haven't asked people sort of psychological. I've done further research from the psychological perspective. But I think part of claiming ownership, and this is claiming ownership of how did Vietnamese really respond to colonization? You know, there wasn't a way for them to assert what did that mean. Most of the time, when you are under colonization and you're told from early history books that you're part of a Gallic ancestry, it's very difficult to say, imagine that you are connected to any other part of Asia. So effectively, my father tells me that when he was a child, they would go to school and they would basically learn French and was told that this is where their ancestors came from, even though they didn't live like them, right? And so in some respect, that continues, that needs to be actually first more for the first generation who come in the diaspora than for the second and subsequent. Before, what I've seen among the second subsequent generation in diaspora is that they're actually going back to Asia, and trying to recapture images of Asian that is not here in America. So yeah, that reclaiming or claiming ownership is something that we can do.
And this may just be an obvious question, but the statue that you showed of Our Lady of Vietnam, I'm just wondering why in some contexts the statues are of Our Lady of Vietnam, and in other contexts is Our Lady of
Yeah, the first name that the Orange County Catholics gave was Our Lady of Vietnam. And once it went to Vietnam, they changed it to Our Lady of and now it's Our Lady also Our Lady.
Oh, so they just use the interchange.
Yes.
Additional questions? Please.
This is a fascinating discussion. What it makes me wonder is whether the process, the call for enculturation, and what processes of very intentional indigenization are in fact a Western import. Insofar as that this is question which has come from the diasporic consciousness, which is naturally affected by American context, questions of civil rights, questions of hyphenated identity. So is this not in fact a kind of neo-colonization of Vietnamese Catholicism?
I guess in one respect you could say that. But also in Vietnam and in many of the Asian countries, there are a lot of different ethnicities that really haven't been addressed. So the Kin people in Vietnam, or the predominant group, have oppressed among the Myanmars, the Khmer and so forth in Vietnam. And their oppression of these smaller ethnic groups have also now been questioned. So ethnologists who say that these people are basically backwards people or country people don't consider them as part of the national conversation. So in some respects, I would agree with you that part of this is sort of Western application, but I think it's an application that's necessary in a country that now has modernized and wants to be on the global scale, and it needs to address issues where women's role have not changed, or women's role has been suppressed again, where they were raised during the 17th and 18th century. So all of these issues need to be addressed, especially as Vietnam is wanting to be part of this on this global scale. So I would say that, yeah, those are Western elements that are being reapplied, not just the image, but also considerations.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for your questions. Let's thank afterwards, so if you have some additional questions or want to extend discussion, one more speakers will be available. And we'll take a break, and the next session begins at 11.